Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining the special Family Weekend event, our teach-in with Jason Reynolds, focusing on his recent book, Stamped: Racism, Anti-Racism, and You. My name is Brian Watkins, and I'm the director of the Office of Parent and Family Affairs here at the University of Maryland. Just a quick housekeeping note for all of our listeners on Zoom. Your cameras and microphones are off. However, we have activated the Q&A feature, and we invite you to submit any questions you have for Jason, and we'll take time at the end to ask questions that you've submitted. If you're not familiar with the Q&A feature, you'll find it at the bottom of the Zoom window. Just click the box and you'll be able to type your question in the Q&A window. Before we begin, it is important for us to acknowledge the land on which the University of Maryland sits. As all of us at the university work to center decoloniality and liberation, it is critical that we recognize our positionality. I invite all of you to listen and reflect as I read the university's land acknowledgement statement, which was developed with and approved by Piscataway tribe elders. At the University of Maryland, we believe it is important to create dialogue to honor those that have been historically and systematically disenfranchised. So we acknowledge the truth that is often buried. We are on the ancestral lands of the Piscataway people, who were among the first in the Western Hemisphere. We are on indigenous land that was stolen from the Piscataway people by European colonists. We pay respects to Piscataway elders and ancestors. Please take a moment to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us together here today. Thank you, everyone. With us today is Jason Reynolds. Jason is the New York Times best-selling author of many books, including Long Way Down and Look Both Ways, among others. He is a National Book Award finalist, the recipient of a Newbery Honor, winner of a Kirkus Prize, and an NAACP Image Award, among other honors. Jason is currently the Library of Congress National Ambassador for Young People's Literature, and I don't want to leave out that he is also a proud Terp, class of 2005. And facilitating the conversation today is Dr. Lamar Jarrell Bruce. Lamar is an interdisciplinary humanities scholar, cultural and literary critic, Black Studies devotee, a first-generation college graduate, and associate professor of American Studies at the University of Maryland. I also happen to be a part-time graduate doctoral student in the American Studies program, so I'm especially excited to have Lamar here as well. His scholarly expertise surrounds Black expressive cultures and the art and aesthetics of quotidian Black life. His scholarly interests more broadly include popular culture studies, LGBTQ studies, disability studies, performance theory, and theories and praxes of love. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you, brother. Thank you. I appreciate it.
I am honored and thrilled to be here, to be in conversation and community with Jason and with the broader UMD family. Thanks so much. And Jason and I chatted briefly earlier this week. It was a rich and critical and easygoing and free-flowing conversation, and I want to continue that here. Jason, thank you for joining us.
Pleasure, man.
We chatted within 30 seconds when we chatted earlier this week. I felt like I was talking to an old friend, like we grew up. and I dig and appreciate that camaraderie.
Absolutely.
So, of course, we're here to discuss Stamped: Racism, Anti-Racism, and You, a book that you published, you collaborated with Ibram Kendi, you published back in March. It's a remix, an adaptation of Ibram Kendi's work, Stamped from the Beginning. So the book is intended especially for adolescents, for middle school and high school students. Let's set the stage before we dive into the book itself. I want to know a little bit about you as a young adult. I want to know, what were your passions? And in particular, what are some of the experiences, some of the people, some of the works of literature and art that impacted your understanding of race and anti-racism when you were an adolescent, a young adult?
Yeah, you know what, man? It's interesting because when I was a kid, when I was a young person, a teenager, I'd be lying if I said there was a lot of literature I was reading that was helping me, because I wasn't reading much. I mean, I had gotten all the way through school, sort of being a bit of a knucklehead and kind of, you know, skirting the work and figuring out how to get by, basically, which I try to be honest about, because it's true, and young people are still doing that today. So many of them, whether we like to admit it or not, you know. And so I hadn't read anything. By the time I got to Maryland, I hadn't read anything. The first book I ever read, I read at Maryland. Like in general, the first book I completed in my life, I completed at the University of Maryland. And it was Richard Wright's Black Boy. And I think Dr. Jean Jarrett had given me that book to read. And that book affected me, but it wasn't, I wouldn't say that was the one that really opened me up. I think after that book, once I sort of, sort of whet my appetite and sort of got myself together when it came to reading, then I started digging back through all this other Black literature that I had never heard of. And the book that really kind of broke me was, there were two books. One, the autobiography of Malcolm X, which arguably is the greatest book ever written. And two, James Baldwin's The Fighter Next Time, which arguably is the greatest book ever written, right? And so like those two books, I had never read language that way. And I had never read about race in that way. And I think those two books were the beginnings of sort of my own self-discovery and how I really feel. And they mirrored some of my own experiences with the experiences of my mother and my family members and my community. And I think that's when I started to kind of dig my heels in.
Okay, wonderful. Your community. So you grew up in PG County, right?
Yeah.
Oxon Hill, yeah?
In Oxon Hill.
Okay. Wonderful.
Which we should say, and you know, it's interesting because Oxon Hill is an interesting place. And so I always talk about this because PG County is a fascinating county, because what happens is like you hear the word PG County, people say, yo, the wealthiest Black population in America, right? And what's fascinating about that for people who aren't from there is that there are like two pockets of that county that sort of mess up the curve and create that sort of narrative, right? But the truth is, I always tell people, if you live in the hills or the heights, you were having a very different experience, right? So if you were in Oxon Hill or in Temple Hills or in Forest Heights or in District Heights or Capitol Heights or Marlow Heights, right? We were having completely different experiences in our communities because the communities were a little more working class. We were dealing with different things. How could the wealthiest Black county in America have so few schools that aren't Title I? How could, right? And so it's an interesting thing. And so whenever I talk about Oxon Hill, whenever I talk about like my upbringing, I talk about Oxon Hill specifically because it was a very specific thing. I never even crossed over exit 11 until I went to Maryland.
Wow. Okay.
Right? Because it felt like an entirely different world. The grass seemed greener. The sky seemed bluer. It was a very different thing. And it's just important to note that. One day I'm going to write about all of that, but because I think it's interesting. It's just interesting, but yeah.
Yeah. Beautiful. And I'm curious to know whether beyond literature, there were other sort of expressive cultural forms that impacted you, that influenced you growing up.
Yeah, man. I was a poet, man. I didn't read, but I wrote it.
Okay.
You know, and so growing up in the late, and I was born in '83, but I got an older brother who's 9 years older than me. So by the time it's like 88, 89, 90, my brother is, 16. Mm-hmm. Right. And so he's listening. So rap music is now growing its legs and taking over the world, right? Or at least taking over every Black community in America. And so my older brother had all the tapes. And so as a kid, I would read rap lyrics because they used to come with the liner notes. You pull it out of the cassette tape and you read the rap lyrics. And that's how I discovered poetry. And so I started writing poems really young. And then I got lucky enough to like catch a wave because 1998, 99, now we're talking like that entire movement had become a new thing. And I got to be at one of the young people. I was like a 15-year-old who they let into the clubs, and I got to sit in the back of the club on U Street and watch all these cats do their thing. And I got to Maryland and was one of the people who got to start the juke joint, which became a huge thing by the time I left. When the juke joint started, there was only 7 of us. Wow. You know what I'm saying? Like, and just thinking about like all of those things. So that's, I mean, expression was always the jam. I just didn't read much, but I expressed a lot.
And that's really important, right? That we recognize the myriad ways in which expressive culture is manifesting. Literature is important, but it's happening in the context of all of these other forms of creativity and expression. Absolutely. So I want to ask you about the origin of this remix. So again, Stamped, Racism, Antiracism, and You is a remix, as you describe it, an adaptation of Ibram Kendi's original text, Stamped from the Beginning. I'd like to hear how the collaboration came to be and maybe some of the challenges and rewards that came along with it.
Well, you know, first let me say this. It's technically, most people consider it an adaptation, but it's not. It's not really an adaptation, right? It is in the traditional sense, but what it actually is, at least the way that I conceptualized it when I did it, was it's more of a translation, right? Because translated works are works that are made new. You know what I mean? If you ask anybody who does any translation work, they'll tell you this is not the same book. This is a completely different book that has been sent through a translator filter and turned into a new thing, right? And that's what we wanted to do. He asked me to do this after the National Book Awards. Both of us were nominated for a National Book Award back in like 2016, I think. And I met him there. It's interesting because no one knew his name back then, right? I met him, we had dinner. The next day, he won the National Book Award. And then 3 weeks later, he was living in DC. And so he called me and was like, yo, I took a job at AU. I'm in the city. I ain't got no friends. Like, what's good? And I was like, all right, let's get a bite to eat or whatever. So we hung out. And he's like, yo, I need you to do something for me. And I'm like, all right, what's up? And he's like, I need you to like do a young people's version of this book. And I was like, nah, bro. I was like, nah. And it's interesting, right? Because people are always like, you said no to Dr. Kendi. And it's like, well, would you have said yes? Right? Like everybody thinks that they'd be totally ready to take on this like tremendous and magnanimous task, right? Everybody's like, yo, how could you say no? Well, how could you say yes, right? Like it's really difficult to take something. I mean, we're talking about an academic tone. I was not a very good student. I struggled at Maryland. I struggle, right? And I want to be clear because I know this is we talking about Maryland. Listen, I loved my time at the University of Maryland outside the classroom. I was not a very good student. I struggled in class. That is just the truth. I struggled in, most people are good in either English or math, and I was terrible in both. I struggled, right? And so for me, it was like, can I take on a piece of scholarship? Okay. Can I really take on a piece of scholarship? I don't know how to study very well. I'm not that good of a researcher. I don't think I could take notes for, like, I'm really kind of like bugging out because I'm checking my own insecurities, right? And then I realize I've hit my like intellectual threshold. And I'm like, yo, I don't really know if I can like intellectually synthesize this work. And I think we'd be afraid to be honest with ourselves, but that's real. I was like, I don't know if I can do this. Yeah. He kept asking. Right? He asked again a week later, a month later, 6 months later. Yo, bro, I really think you need to do this for me. Like, you could do this, you could do this, you could do this. And eventually I said yes, because he convinced me that it was just bigger than the both of us, and that he saw whatever he saw in me. He had read all my work. He knew what I was doing in the children's world. He knew sort of the things that I had accomplished. And he was like, bro, you can do it. Like, it's you can do it. So I took a couple of years. I wrote a few different drafts of it, but I was trying to adapt it. I was trying to do a younger version of his work, right? And every time I would finish it, it'd be like 400 pages still, or it would read too static, or it would read too academic, right? And so finally I decided I was gonna quit. And so I'm gonna go to New York, I'm gonna talk to our editor, I'm gonna pay her the money back, and I'm gonna tell her I'm backing out. I just ain't got the chops for it, right? So I get real true story. This is the story. So I go to New York, we have lunch. I'm like, Lisa, look, I appreciate the opportunity, but like, I think I'm gonna go ahead and back out of it. I've tried, it ain't really slapping. I can't get it to work. And she said, yo, you keep trying to make a version of his book. You keep trying to make your version of his book. What we keep telling you is we want you to make your book just using his information, but make your book using his research. That's it. And I was like, well, in order for me to do that, I gotta ruin his book. And she was like, okay. I was like, no, I mean, I gotta like poke fun at his book. And that's the reason why the book starts with, this is not a history book. That's why it starts that way. Because the moment I knew that I could like turn it over and be irreverent which is how I live my life, right? I want to shake the table. And I wrote down, this is not a history book. Then I was good to go. And then 6 months later, I was done, and we were good money. Yeah.
First of all, I want to commend you for your willingness to acknowledge your insecurities and your vulnerabilities, right? As accomplished, as brilliant as you are, I want the young people listening to sort of recognize, right, that the most accomplished among us live with, work through vulnerability or insecurity. And sometimes, right, there's tremendous power in acknowledging your vulnerability and working through it. So kudos to you. And I hope that the people, the young folks listening, take heed of that.
Absolutely.
Those among them who may be struggling in school or may be struggling with doubt about taking on tasks that feel momentous, you struggle with that doubt, you push through, and
Absolutely.
Here we are. So
here we are.
Yes, kudos to you. I want to pick up on something that you just mentioned. This is not a history book. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that claim, that declaration?
Yeah. So it's twofold, right? I mean, the first one is strictly strictly for stimulation, right? I think about who I was when I was 14, who I was when I was 13. Shoot, who I was sitting in the Maryland classroom, right? As a young person, and I was thinking about how history books have always been written for students, not for humans.
Huh.
For students, they're always written for scholarship. It's always about everything seems to be intellectualized in terms of the way it's presented. The dissemination of history always comes through an intellectualized or an absolutely sort of like cold and almost a little milk toasty, right? This idea that we can't have any emotion, there can't be any style, there can't be any flavor, it has to just be the facts, because that's what and my whole thing is, who wants to engage? If you're a young person, first of all, when I was growing up, I wouldn't have wanted to engage. And today they have even more stimulation and even more stimuli to sort of compete with this. Why do we think this is going to work? Mm-hmm. And so the first thing I needed to do was, from the beginning of the book, let young people know this ain't that.
Yes.
And by that, I mean, this is not going to be a textbook. It's not going to be that thing that brick that you carry around in your backpack every day that you can't actually stand, but you know you got to do it because there's a grade attached to it. What if we could figure out a way to make it something that you actually do want, right? So that was the first thing. Number two, it's not a history book because history ain't really a thing, right? It's only a thing as it's contextualized with the present and the future. But it's not a thing that exists in its own, in this weird vacuum. Like the present doesn't exist in a vacuum because history exists, right? And so we wanted to make sure that we were clear about the fact that race is a perennial issue in America. It is not a historic thing. There are historic elements that explain why we are and who we are, where we are today, right? And who we are today. But it's really a through line, right? It's almost like the whole, there's actually there's no break between continents, right? That there's actually a floor underneath the water, but it's really just one piece of land, right? And that the water that's splitting the continents seems like it's this separating force, that there's this country and this country, but really there's really just one massive piece of land with a piece of water going through it, but there's a floor there. That's how history in the present and the future are. It's one piece of land, right, that we then put separating and dividing walls in the middle of, using semantics and rhetoric like history and past and present and future, right? But the truth is, it's all the same sort of plane. And if we think about it that way, then we can grapple with it differently. And I think that's the reason I wanted to sort of present it as not history, but actually a different part of the present.
Absolutely, absolutely. So the book traces the evolution of racist ideas and racist structures, as well as anti-racist movement and organizing and revolutionary thought, right, across 5 or so centuries. So we start out in the 15th century, and we move eventually through Enlightenment, various transatlantic revolutions to Civil
Reformation,
Reconstruction, all the way through the Black Power movement and the current moment, Black Lives Matter, the Black Lives Matter zeitgeist. As you pointed out, part of what distinguishes this this book from history books, traditional history books, is that it's written in a vernacular style. It emulates everyday speech, right? Where most students, as you pointed out, are accustomed to a more rigid, formal, stodgy style, right? I think this makes it especially powerful when read aloud. And I would love to ask you to read chapter 9, very brief chapter, aloud so we can hear that. I think this particular text really benefits. And I encourage those listening to purchase the book and to read it aloud, to read it in community aloud, to hear.
Yeah. All right, here we go. Chapter 9, Uplift Suasion. This is a short chapter. Imagine it as a parenthetical, a side note, a just so you know. Black people, slaves, started to get free, runaways, and abolitionists urged the newly freed people to go to church regularly, learn to speak proper English, learn math, adopt trades, get married, stay away from vices, smoking and drinking, and basically live what they would consider to be respectable lives. Basically, live like white people. If Black people behaved admirably, they could prove all the stereotypes about them were wrong. This strategy was called Uplift Suasion. It was racist because what it said was that Black people couldn't be accepted as themselves and that they had to fit into some kind of white mold to deserve their freedom. But in the 1790s, Uplift Suasion was working. At least it seemed to be. It's important that you keep this in mind because it would be the cornerstone of assimilationist thought, which basically said, make yourself small, make yourself unthreatening, make yourself the same, make yourself safe, make yourself quiet to make white people comfortable with your existence.
That's powerful. And I wish that I could share my screen to show you. I have the electronic version, but to show you the typography. That's really important in this text, right?
Yeah, I can show you. I think I got it. Let me show you. You can see what it looks like on the page, you know?
Yes. Yes. So that last passage that you read, make yourself small, make yourself unthreatening, make yourself the same, that is written out in verse. Yeah. And it makes clear that this was almost a sort of mantra, a chant that Black people invested in Uplift Suasion might need to recite to themselves continuously. And I just appreciate you often use really bold, large lettering for emphasis. You sometimes use this verse style in order to sort of generate various effects. So the book is something that engages the senses on various registers. But again, I encourage folks to read that out loud. Thank you for that reading. And even the way I want
to say really quickly, man, before you move on, I want to say that style is something I do all the time in a lot of my books, but I want to make it clear that that style is also rooted in the work that we make. If you go back to the 1920s, 1930s, you read Gene Toomer's Cane, right? And what you will see is that style. Yeah, we've been on that, right? Shout out to Gene Toomer. He was a complicated man, but he was a brilliant writer.
Absolutely. Even though you begin the chapter, this is a short chapter. Imagine it as a parenthetical, a side note, a just so you know, right? That sort of aside, that sort of nudging the reader, right? Not attempting to presume this this position or quality of objectivity, right? Yes. That's critically important. So thank you for that. Now, I want to talk about assimilationism, segregationism, and anti-racism, or the figures of the assimilationists, the segregationists, and the anti-racist, which you bring up in the text. I think these are key terms and part of the key intervention that the text makes. So can you talk to us about these three categories?
Yeah, you know, the segregationist is, you know, this is the person that we typically think of when we think of a racist. All right, when we think of racism, what we usually are thinking of, especially as young people, we're thinking of segregationism, this idea that I'm being stopped, right? That I cannot do something because of the way I look, or the color of my skin, or somebody is stopping me from doing something, or prohibiting me from living a free life, or the life that I want to live simply because of the color of my skin. And in the book, I break it down and I make it very simple. And I just think of these people as haters, right? Like, we know what a hater is. We know what a hater do, right? All the young folks watching, y'all know what a hater do. Y'all know who haters are. Y'all know how they move, right? And their whole job is to hate you just because you ain't like them, you know? And then you got the assimilationists. Now, the thing about assimilationism and what's complicated about it is that this is something that almost all of us are a part of. even if we don't want to be, right? Almost all of us are sort of wading in an interesting assimilationist waters, right? These interesting assimilationist waters. Now, we don't always know that we're assimilating, right? But the basic premise is that Black people could attain freedom and equality and equity if they act more like the standard, right? And in this country, the standard has been set as whiteness, right? So as long as I can, like, my proximity to whiteness means that I have a proximity to freedom.
Yes.
Right. I have a proximity to equity. I have a proximity to equality. I have a proximity to money. Right. These are all the things. This is the reason. Look, I always laugh about. I love. America's a complicated place, but it's my home, right? And I always find it interesting because it's like, yo, so we multicultural, but if I take an office job and let's say I'm coming from Nigeria, I can't put on my normal, like what if I want to dress in Nigerian garb and come to my office job? Is it suddenly seen as unprofessional because y'all say I got to wear a shirt and tie? Yeah. Right. But if I got to wear a shirt and tie and it's not really who I am, but it's the office sort of politics. It's the way the office is structured and I got to fit into that. Is it truly multicultural? I'm not sure. Right. And these are the questions that we have to ask ourselves. And in our everyday lives, young people in our everyday lives, these are your fake friends. Yeah. Everybody know they got fake friends. We all know these people where it's like, oh yeah, we cool, but we not really cool. The friend that be like, hey, how you doing? And turn around and talk about what you got on behind your back. These are the people that's basically like, I'm cool with you as long as you act like me. We all know these people, right? And then the last sort of category is the anti-racist. And really, this is what we're all striving for. And all look, there's all this work coming out about like anti-racism and about what it is. And there's so much information right now being pushed through the channels about anti-racism. And the wild part about it is that it's mad simple. All it's about is love and acceptance. And not tolerance, by the way. I ain't really one for tolerance. I think we got to be careful and intentional about our language, right? Right? I'm talking about acceptance, right? We got to accept each other. It don't mean I got to accept what you do, but I got to accept who you are. That's it, right? Because you deserve to be because you are. Period. There's nothing else to it. You deserve to be a human in this world with a free life because you are a human in this world. That's the end of the story. That's all an anti-racist says. So and those are like your real friends. Those are people who love you. They love you not because you like them. They love you because you like you. Simple as that.
Yeah. I think it's so important that in the book you point out and you share stories of various figures who have transitioned from one category to the next, right? Yeah. There are a number of protagonists in the book, right? You go back as far as folks like Cotton Mather, through W.E.B. Du Bois, Marcus Garvey, Booker T. Washington, Angela Davis is very prominently featured, Barack Obama, right? You ask us to think about the evolution of these individuals as it relates to these categories. And it's critical that you recognize they're not rigid. People don't rigidly remain in one, or don't necessarily rigidly remain in one category, that it is possible to evolve from an assimilationist stance to an anti-racist stance, for example. And that's something that we should be aspiring toward. So thank you.
And I also want to say that, like, there are moments within an hour that I teeter between anti-racism and assimilationism. Within an hour. Yeah. Right. And that becoming an anti-racist isn't actually a thing. The job is to become more anti-racist, right? And so you're constantly working toward a thing. There is no destination. There is no finish line. We have to constantly be sort of checking ourselves and evaluating ourselves, because as racism continues to evolve, we have to continue to, the way that we assess it has to continue to evolve. So there is no like end game, right? We're just constantly working to live more anti-racist lives.
Absolutely, a constant practice, a constant process, a constant journey. I would love to really turn our attention to the current political moment. I watched the presidential debate a few days ago, and Chris Wallace, the moderator, there was this really poignant moment where he said to the candidates, I'm going to ask a question about race. If you want to respond about something else, you can. And I think that's indicative, and I'll repeat that. I'm going to ask a question about race. If you want to respond to something else, you can. And I think that's indicative of how discussions about race happen in the United States. So often there's avoidance and cowardice and deflection and talking in circles, not to mention the dog whistles and the code words, right?
Sure.
So the book is currently configured. It extends through maybe 2014 or so, with the sort of rise of the Black Lives Matter movement. I'm curious to know if you were to generate a postscript that extends to the current moment, what are some of the additional insights you might add to speak to racial discourse right now, social media, news media, the political arena, et cetera?
I think that's a good question, man. I think there's a lot to unpack. I think there'd be, I would have loved to write about how COVID disproportionately affected Black people and continues to affect Black people, and why that is, and the way that the media spun it, right? So like when those statistics came out, the way the media spun it was that Black people was as if Black people weren't wearing masks, right? Or Black people were being irresponsible, which wasn't the case. What it was that more Black people had those jobs that they call my older brother, an essential worker who forced to go to work as nurses and custodial workers and teachers and all these other things that put them sort of in jeopardy, let alone so many Black folks in this country are disproportionately under-resourced when it comes to insurance, health benefits, housing. We can go on and on and on. It's like, it's easy for you to be like, to say that, but if I live in an apartment building, there's 100 people connected to my house, right? If me walking out my door and they walking out their door at the same time is a complicated thing. Or if you live in my neighborhood right here in DC, and at the end of my block, there's a food bank, and I got to get food because I can't go to work no more.
Yes.
And I gotta get food, right? Meaning I gotta stand outside on the line to get food from the food bank. Then I put myself in jeopardy, but I gotta feed my children. It's complicated, right? And I think that it took them a long time. I think Cuomo started to talk about like why some of these things are the case. And it isn't that Black people are being more irresponsible than white people. That's just not the case. So I would add that COVID has been interesting when it comes to the racial dynamic. And of course, I would add look, we could continue the book in terms of Black Lives Matter movement and the killing of unarmed Black people by police. I think 2020 has been brutal when it comes to that. Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor.
Yeah, George Floyd.
I think, and even thinking about Chris, what was the brother's name? The birder.
Yes, I know. It's hard to keep track.
Even thinking about him, and of course he tamped it all down himself. But I think about him all the time because, because for all intents and purposes, if you were to contextualize that for Black people in the world that we live in this country, it's attempted murder, right? So like it's an interesting thing that she did and for those who don't know, basically, what's his name? Chris Carter? I don't remember his name. Basically, for those who don't know, there was a Black man walking in Central Park. He's a birder, which means he's a bird watcher. That's literally what he was going to do. There was a white woman with a dog off the leash, which is against the rules.
Chris Cooper, by the way. Chris
Cooper. Thank you. Chris Cooper is walking through Central Park. He's a birder. There's a white woman with a dog off the leash, which is against the rules in that part of Central Park because it affects the birds, right? And so he says, you got to put your dog on a leash. They have a bit of an altercation. He does not touch her. He does not raise his voice. None of that happens, right? He's not even close to her. And she ends up threatening him, saying, I will call the cops and tell them that a Black man has assaulted me in the park, and proceeds to do so, right? Like, and I just think weaponizing privilege is to see that, right? And to talk about the weaponization of privilege in 2020, which is not a new thing. The book is all about that, right? It has several instances where they talk about the weaponization of privilege, but like to see that in 2020, I think would have been interesting. And then of course the election and all the things that are going on with the news cycle and social media and all of this kind of stuff. Of course, there's just so much to unpack. There's just more than we have time for here, but there's so, I mean, even thinking about like the role of Kamala Harris, like what is her role, right? Like what it's hard. Listen, let me tell you something, Lamar. Every day of my life, I've been fighting to not become a cynic because I don't think it's healthy. But I am a bit of a skeptic, and and because America has been America for as long as America has been, I think it is almost irresponsible to not ask ourselves really hard questions about the decisions being made in the political sphere. Period. No matter what the decision is, we should be like, but why? Let's ask them. It doesn't mean it's a bad decision, but we should always be sort of challenging and asking ourselves why. We should be complicating every argument. It's healthy. It's good. That's all.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you for that. We have about 5 minutes. I want to leave you with one more question before we transition to the Q&A.
Yeah.
With young people. So you are an extraordinary Renaissance man, right? You're an author who's worked in the fiction form. You did a graphic novel recently. You're a poet. You're a vernacular historian. Are there other types of writing that you hope to explore, other projects you have in mind? I kept thinking about what it would mean to see, for example, a stamped documentary film targeted toward young people, and what it would mean for you to write the screenplay for a film. I don't know, a theatrical script, maybe drop a hip hop album. I'm curious about what other modes of creativity are calling out to you now and what we might have in store.
So that's a good question, man. I mean, I was a songwriter for a very long time. So I worked in that world in my early 20s, which was dope and cool. And I got to work with a lot of cool people and make a lot of cool stuff. I am doing some screen stuff now. So I am, as far as stamp goes, there is some talk about all of that, but I can't speak about it. But there is some talk about it going to the screen. But I am doing some screenplay stuff that I'm working on for some of my other books and some adaptation stuff. I'm actually, right after I get off this call, I'm actually going to sign on to it. I'm taking a class today actually about essay writing. I want to tap into some essay work and you know, get my essay chops up, and because some things I just need to say, you know, and I would love to write a collection of essays that talk about maybe my time with kids. You know, I've been fortunate. I've been around millions of kids around the world, and I just have all these stories that I want to tell about some of the most brilliant and interesting young people on the planet, and maybe writing. And you never get essay collections about that kind of stuff, right? Like here's my life with children, you know what I mean? I don't know, man. I'm open, but if look, here's my belief. My belief is I got 26 letters, bro. 26 letters. And I get to manipulate those 26 letters however I choose. And there's no limit, right, on the combination that exists. So whether it's essays or songs or poems or stories or, you know, history or whatever, right? Picture books or comic books.
Genre. You can invent your own genres, right?
Exactly. As long as I got them 26 letters, then the possibilities are endless.
Yeah. And I want to encourage young folks watching to be open-minded about the various ways that they can intervene. I tell myself often that, for example, when they think of activism, a lot of students think that activism has to mean marching on a picket line. That's one way to intervene, absolutely, but there's so many other ways to participate in and contribute to social transformation. When it comes to creativity, when it comes to expressing oneself with language, sure, writing books can be a phenomenal way to intervene, but writing song lyrics, writing, tweeting for that matter, right? Poetry, these are all ways that we can intervene, that our language can impact the worlds that we inhabit.
Absolutely.
And the genre of the tweet is so critically important, right? In this 21st century, for better and worse.
Of course.
Yes. So I think it's about time. I want to give the young people some time to ask questions. So thank you again, Jason, for
my pleasure, brother.
Openness, your energy, the good spirit, the love that you bring to this process. And I
you already know.
Continue conversation with you.
Yeah, brother, we'll talk for sure.
All right, take care.
Thank you both. And I actually, first question really kind of goes to both of you, because I think, Lamar, you had said earlier about how literature is important, but it happens in so many expressive forms. In kind of speaking to Jason, how you weren't really an avid reader. And I think there are a lot of parents who and I'll speak for myself, who, you know, they might not have a young reader. Like they can read, but they don't enjoy reading.
Right.
And what do you say to that? Because I do think it's important to acknowledge that there are many expressive forms and ways to use words.
Yeah. You know, for me, I think that the biggest, my biggest sort of issue with it is that we have to make decisions about what it is that we are trying to promote. Is it literature or is it literacy? If it's literacy, then let's do that, which means that we get to then open up the landscape of what it means to read. Everything has to be on the table, right? I think to limit what is readable is to then limit the opportunity and possibility of that young person becoming a reader. So for me, whatever you're interested in, don't worry, there's books, there's magazines. If you like sports, cool, we get you Sports Illustrated, you can read that, right? We get you, if you like Fortnite or you like, Minecraft, cool, there's books about it. There's no problem. We got Minecraft books all over the place. I got friends who write these books, right? Minecraft books and Fortnite books, whatever. We shouldn't limit them, because the truth of the matter is reading is all about the building of the mind muscle. No one is made, listen, I have never read Moby Dick. I was supposed to read it when I was at Maryland, never read it, right? And guess what? I am not made worse for having not read it. Yeah. I'm still okay, everybody. Like, I'm still okay. So I think we just got to promote literacy, and all that entails.
Yeah. And Brian, I'll just say this very quickly. As an educator, it's incumbent upon me to respect, to honor, to expose students to various ways in which language can be impactful. So I teach a course called Soundtrack to Revolution, Black Protest Music from the Slave Ship to SoundCloud. I don't have students write a standard term paper for that course. They have to generate a protest playlist of songs that speak to a particular social justice issue. And their final paper, it's called liner notes. They have to curate an album and generate liner notes that speak to the social justice issue and how these songs resonate with the social justice issue. We as educators, and I use the term educators broadly, I'm a college professor. This applies to high school, middle school, elementary school teachers. It applies to parents and guardians too, right? Because parents and guardians are constantly in the position of teaching, of imparting to their young ones. Honor, respect, and expose your students to various modes of literacy, of expressive language and expressive culture more broadly, so that they can move forward with the sort of the sheer cornucopia of possibilities for expressive output, for creativity. Yeah.
Heard up.
Yeah.
I'm gonna take that class. I'm gonna come audit your class, bro.
Come through.
Yeah, thank you both for that. And Jason, some of us may actually have been harmed by reading Moby Dick, so we're good. Jason, the publishing world can be brutal. I think in so many ways really centered on whiteness and what is acceptable, acceptable, what is marketable, and what isn't. And so I'm wondering if you've encountered this as you've tried to get books published, what that's been like for you. What have you encountered?
Yeah, I mean, of course, man, I've been in this industry 15 years, man, and I've seen a little bit of it all. I mean, I remember when I wrote When I Was the Greatest, which was the first novel, nobody wanted to, nobody wanted to publish it. So basically there were two houses that decided to take a swing on it, but we had sent it out to 15 and everyone was like, yeah, 15 editors. And they were like, this is not going to sell. It's not marketable. And it was just about little Black boys hanging out in the neighborhood. Like, it wasn't, so there's an interesting thing that happens where it's like, well, we'll publish a story about Black kids if there's trauma, right? So if there's trauma, then there's a market for it. But if y'all just chilling, it's about family and friendship, and maybe there's and like the plot points are not so drastic. Like there's conflict, but nothing explosive is gonna happen, right? Like you're not gonna lose a limb, right? Then back then, especially, people were a little more reticent. They really believed that there was no market for it. And I always tell people, they use, it's all about numbers, right? So they use these numbers and they say, well, the numbers say Black kids ain't reading these books, right? So because Black kids ain't reading books, we're not gonna publish books about Black kids. Whereas if somebody like me were to look at those same statistics, I'd say, oh, look, Black kids aren't reading books, probably because there are no books about Black kids, right? Like, so we should make more of those books, right? And it turned out that was true. That was true. We're seeing a huge shift over the last 15 years, over the last 6 years. I've watched whole curriculums turn over. Right? I mean, and not just from my 15 books, but there's tons of, I have colleagues who've come in the game who have just like people are moving forward. The other thing is, and we have to be honest about this, is that there's a huge gap in when it comes to like the reading lives of the American public. From 1980 to around 1999, if you were a young person growing up in that time, there's a good chance you weren't doing a whole lot of reading, at least not about yourself. You know why? Because there weren't a whole lot of books for young people, for young people about Black kids being written about the time in which they were growing up. So we were all forced to read books from the 1970s, books from the 1960s. People reading the Babysitter's Club like it was taking place in the 90s. It wasn't, right? People reading the Hardy Boys and all that. But what we reading Goosebumps, which by the way, I love Bob Stein, shout out to the G, but the truth is, if you were growing up in the community and you wanted to see your neighborhood, those books didn't exist. And we had like the OG Walter D. Myers, but his sweet spot was the 1970s. Mm-hmm. So the 80s and the 90s is a missed generation. There's no literary archive of our lives, which is wild to think about. And so I wonder if we would have had those books in place, if that generation, the hip hop generation, like the original hip hop generation, if we would have grown up as readers. And I think we're seeing it happen now. Contemporary work always works.
Yeah, thank you. We did get some questions submitted through the Q&A. What inspired you to become a writer of novels for young adults?
You know what? I'll be honest with you. At first, that's not what the plan was. I didn't even know there was a such thing, right? Like I had no idea that was even a category. I had written, while at Maryland, my college roommate and I made a book while we were there. Back then, you could like go out front at the Stamp Student Union, fill out a piece of paper, and they give you a Nokia phone and a credit card that's got $30,000 on it. And so we did that, and we maxed out the credit card and got these books made. And then we moved to New York. Now we're 19 at the time, right? 19, 20. We moved to New York, and we find an agent who's willing to look at this book. And she's like, look, you guys can do this again. I'll get you guys a deal, but this got to be for young people. At the time, we were like, nah, we grown. I look back now and I realized at 20 years old, I was a young person. So the way the book felt, the voice of it, the way that what we were trying to say was all geared toward like 18-year-olds, right? And so they categorized that book as YA, and that was that. That's where I was. And then I started to meet young people on tour and like really spend time, and I realized, man, it's funny how sometimes life chooses you. And that was it. I was where I was supposed to be.
Well, and it is indeed where you're supposed to be, because you've really inspired a lot of young people.
Thanks, man.
And to get back to Stamped for just a moment, you know, when I was talking to my son about, because we've been reading Stamped together and aloud. Lamar, I appreciate you saying that. I mean, it really is meant to be, I think, read aloud. The words are the way you write is just really beautiful. But what Noah had noted is that you know, you've taken this really difficult and deep and painful material, and you find ways to inject humor. How do you decide when to do that? And it also really just speaks to the relatable nature of what you've presented in this book.
Man, you know, I believe life is way too serious to take seriously. And when you think about the absurdity of it all, you know, when you really think about it, some of it, though painful and violent and complicated, when you really were, if you were to extract some of that from it and really just think about what's happening, it's kind of goofy, right? It really is kind of goofy, right? Like the idea that I mean, look, I can't, like Aristotle says, yo, man, you know why Africans are savages? Because it's hot in Africa. That's it. That's all you got. Like that's your reasoning behind all this. And for me, it was like, yo, that's just so silly that I can't not poke fun at how silly it all is, man. I think that life, look, and that's something, this is talking about, like, the cultural traditions are also complicated things to nail down. I'm sure there are professors and anthropologists, you know, here to do that work, but there is something about Black people surviving by walking the line of humor, right? It's a very, 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 it's a survival skill that so many of us have had to use. There are all kinds of brilliant documentaries about it. It is something that we continue. My mother has said to me, you don't never trust nobody who only cries and don't laugh. Like, it's just not a thing for us. And I think I wanted to be honest about that in the book. Even as heavy and as weighted as this is, we can always make a little time to laugh. We really don't have a choice. Either this going to drive you off the cliff, or you're going to find some humor in it and push forward, you know?
Another question from a listener. You had mentioned that you initially refused Ibram Kendi's request because you viewed his work as an academic tome. Had you read his book at that point? And if not, did you find it to be as daunting as you expected?
So I had tried to read his book before. And then when I took on this gig, I've read that book probably 8 times through, all the way through. And did I find it to be as daunting as I expected it to be? Yes. It's a lot of information. It's a lot, and it's no fault of his. I'm not saying that he did anything wrong. No, what he made was, as far as I'm concerned, is a mess. He should be applauded for that much work and for what. There are professors at Maryland doing the same thing right now. Isabel Wilkerson, right, has done this, right. Look, The Warmth of Other Suns is brilliant and a lot, right. And so yeah, it was daunting. It was hard. Am I glad I read it? Yes. But it was tough, but so what? Some things are hard, like it's fine. But it was definitely as daunting as I thought it was. Not as daunting as Moby Dick.
Jason, one final question. For young people who hope to write a book or even publish and publish in any medium, what advice do you give them?
Well, I think there's some questions you gotta ask yourself. Number one, do you want to be a writer or do you want to be famous? Those two things might not be the same. So we gotta have an honest conversation with yourself first and foremost, because those two things aren't automatically connected. But if you want to be a writer, then you just go ahead and do the thing, right? Writing is about action, right? Writing is about writing. And so what happens is, young folks, is that as you get older, you'll start seeing people who say, man, I got a book in me. And you'll see that same person 3 years later and they say, man, I got a book in me. And then 6 years after that, they say, man, I'm getting ready to start my book. They never gonna do it. Because writing is literally about doing the thing. Like there's no magic to it. One word in front of the next, one line in front of the next, one paragraph, one page, one chapter. There's literally no magic. If you sit down, you don't wait for any inspiration. You live an inspired life, you ain't gotta wait for it. Right? You let it all come in, you sit down, and it's grueling and it's difficult. So if you are afraid of difficulty, this will be a challenge. Easy and difficult are irrelevant concepts. All that matters is, are you going to do it or are you not going to do it? And lastly, I'll share with you what I was told when I was at Maryland. I had actually gone, I was 17, I had gone to a lecture. Mary Baraka, who is now passed away, famous poet, had come to the university to give a talk. And I raised my hand, young guy in the back of the room for the Q&A. I raised my hand and I asked this very question, right? This is like the obligatory question. What advice would you give, a young writer? And Amir Baraka came off the stage and he walked down the aisle toward me and he said, listen, kid, I'm going to tell you a story. He said, Billy the Kid in the Old Wild West was challenged. And they asked him, they said they would pay him a bunch of money if he could pull out his pistol and shoot a bullet through a grass blade. And so the next day, they all came out to the town square. Billy walked up, he pulled out his pistol, and he shot a bullet straight through a grass blade with no problems. And the people said, oh my God, Billy, how did you do that? How did you do that without even aiming? And his response was, I'm always aiming. Now, the moral to that story is, if you want to be a writer, you keep your tools with you all the time. You keep your notebook, you keep your pen, your pad, you keep your laptop, I got your phones, whatever you need to be ready for the thing when it comes. You got to have all your tools always with you all the time. Always be aiming. Yeah,
stay ready so you don't have to get ready, as they say.
There you go, as all of our uncles said.
I am just so appreciative of both of you, and Jason, thank you so much for spending time with us today. It's been incredibly informative, and we just appreciate the gifts that you that you bring and present to the world.
My pleasure, man. It's been a good, hey, shout out to Testudo, shout out to the Turks. I got a lot of love for y'all. I learned a lot about myself when I was there. So this has been an honor, man, for sure.
Thank you. And Lamar, thank you so much for facilitating this conversation.
Absolutely. It was a pleasure and honor.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you both. And thank you everyone for
please.
joining us today. We appreciate that you were part of this session, and I hope everyone has a good rest of the weekend.